This lovely sunny afternoon, and thank you for joining us here at LSBU. So I want to welcome you to the university, but also to this event, which is hosted by the School of Law and Social Sciences and by the school's Race, Gender and Sexualities Research Group. And this event is part 8 of a year-long series of events celebrating 100 years of LSBU teaching engineering to women students. A discovery that we made when our colleague Claire Benson in engineering spoke to myself and to our university archivist, Ruth MacLeod, who's going to be speaking today, and thought this was a really significant event and we should do something about it. So in this event in particular, as I said, one of a year-long series of events, we're going to consider within this pioneering history of LSBU teaching engineering. We're going to look at the wider context of female education in 20th century Britain and how these gender stereotypes have evolved and developed, how are they constantly perpetuated, and what we can do to smash those gender stereotypes. So that is the overall intention of today's panel. We have a stellar group of academics joining us. Incredibly privileged to have Professor Becky Francis, Professor Stephanie Spencer, Linda Edwards Shea and Ruth MacLeod on our panel, and I'll be introducing them all just before they speak. So I think without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, who is Professor Becky Francis. Hi Becky, welcome to LSBU. It's a shame we can't actually be here in person, but you know, what can we do? So Becky is Chief Executive Officer of the Education Endowment Foundation, and she was previously Director of the UCL Institute of Education. Her prior roles include Professor of Education and Social Justice at King's College London, and Director of Education at the RSA and Standing Advisor to the Parliamentary Education Select Committee. And no doubt you will have seen Becky on the telly, because she has been appearing on Newsnight and various other really important media outlets to talk about the whole issue around particularly education catch-up, which is one of her very significant and important concerns right now. So throughout her career, Becky has sought to maximise the impact of academic research by working closely with teachers and policymakers, and she has spearheaded the high-profile research programmes assessing the impact of major reforms on the English school system and on educational inequalities, which is a problem that is not going away, and therefore we do need people like Becky really speaking out and informing change particularly through kind of academic rigour. Becky is also co-author of the Fawcett Society's recent report published in 2019 on limited potential, and that was a report on the Commission on Gender Stereotypes in Early Childhood. And I think Becky is going to make reference to that report in her contribution today. So with great pleasure, I'm going to hand over to Becky.
Thanks so much, Kate, and for that very fulsome welcome. I'm just trying to see my slide deck and pull that up so I can share that with you. And I'll try to keep this brief, which will mean, I'm afraid, slightly charging through, but I hope that's okay. I hope you can see that clearly now. As Kate said, I've been involved with gender and education academic research for a very long time, a sadly long time as I get older. And these are some of my publications, but the particular one that, as Kate's already highlighted today, is the one in the middle, the Unlimited Potential Fawcett Society Commission that was published at the end of last year, and where I was co-chair along with David Lammy MP. So I'll talk about that some more in a second. But in terms of the kind of, I guess, almost 30 years that I've now been involved in gender and education research, we've seen many changes. There have, of course, been changes in social attitude. That's reflected in legislation and policy. And of course, those changes have also shifted and driven social change too. There's also, whereas we tend to think of there being sort of positive progress always, Actually, that's not always been the case. There's been this exacerbation of stereotypical expectations and performances in some areas. Notably, of course, what we wouldn't have predicted 25 years ago is the explosion of impact with social media and the different practices that promulgates. In terms of education particularly, there has, of course, been a move from the feminist studies in the sort of reflecting the second wave in the 1970s and 80s, which focused very much on classroom experience and interaction, then towards a focus on attainment, which was characterized by a sort of moral panic, if you like, around boys' underachievement, and then feminist responses to that. And then even just recently, we see a pulling back to attention to experience, notably with the complaints around sexual harassment and sexual misconduct that have exploded in the last few weeks, but that, of course, again, feminist researchers were documenting back in the 1980s. So some things change and some stay the same. In terms of academic work in the field, there's been a really strong and I think very productive literature that's developed focusing on the identification of inequalities and the analysis and explanations for the trends that we see in relation to gender and education. I think as a field, we've been less good at strategies for change and indeed sometimes with engagement with policy and practice. We tend to be taking a sort of critical stance, responding to events rather than necessarily being sort of, forward thinking and taking solutions to policymakers. And I think that that's partly reflected by the tendency for qualitative work, which is of course incredibly important in terms of explaining the kind of what and the how, but a relative lack of certainly experimental work and being able to create solutions. Crashing through the some sort of key findings, I'll let you look through this slide, but there's been a lot of attention over the last 2 decades on both the official curriculum and its gendered nature, but also the hidden curriculum primarily, and what is being modelled in the school classroom and playground. There's long-standing documentation, for example, of kind of unconscious biases and stereotypical beliefs by practitioners and others about, for example, girls achieving through their diligence and hard work, boys as natural achievers, who have an innate brilliance, but, underperform because of their laziness, etc., etc. You can see how these stereotypes are coming through already. And again, the tendency for certain boys, again, I caveat, of course, this isn't about the distinct groups, the boys, the girls. There's diversity across those groups, as we know, but nevertheless, classroom discourse and classroom space still tending to be dominated by particular boys. And the final sub-bullet there, the early experiences via the resources and messages that young people are offered can affect later curriculum choices and, of course, then choices going into the workplace and so forth. The bottom bullets are highlighting about the interaction with identity formation and, of course, importantly, intersectionality here as well. Now, this dense slide highlights a few of the points that we distilled for the Fawcett Society Commission, again showing the impact of gender stereotypes, in this case in the early years. So I'll just let you very quickly read through that information. So I guess this is really highlighting some of the, the powerful messages of the research that's been conducted to date, but also the importance of addressing these stereotypes. Given the celebratory nature of this event in relation to engineering, I thought it was also pertinent to highlight this project that I've been involved with. This is led by Professor Louise Archer, the Aspires longitudinal cohort study that I've had the privilege to be involved with over the last 10 years now. And this is a paper that I led looking at the gendered construction of physics as a hard and therefore masculinized subject area, and the kind of perpetuation of that construction that has then, of course, both a knock-on to engineering, but also the double impact in relation to engineering, as we highlight in this paper, because we found that many, both girls and boys, were constructing engineering as not just hard, difficult, but a very physical occupation as well, that involved, working with your hands and getting dirty. So again, you can see some of the gendered assumptions and the ways that these discourses perpetuate gendered messages with impact for young people's choices and so forth in relation to their social identities. And this slide captures a paper on gendered toys and media resources aimed at children that I authored. Just these stereotypical discourses that perpetuate discourses of innate and natural gender difference between girls, boys, men, women, a discourse of females as caring, men as active subjects, the importance of aesthetics for girls, and this dominant narrative of sort of compulsory heterosexuality coming through these children's resources. So again, I guess I'm trying to pick out what's changed, what stays the same. We know that in summary of the research evidence here, it's in schools where gender constructions are less accentuated that boys tend to do better. So dampening these gender stereotypes actually facilitates attainment of girls and boys. And strategies that work to reduce constructions of gender difference that are most effective in facilitating boys' achievement and, of course, girls' achievement too. And that requires a leadership intervention, real commitment and a whole school approach. And I guess that in terms of that notion of a holistic approach to address this challenge, and as Kate said, smash gender stereotypes, the Foresight Society Commission really highlighted how that holistic approach needs to take and engage multiple stakeholders. So we had recommendations for government, recommendations for early years, both practitioners and those preparing early years practitioners. We have recommendations for parents, and importantly, recommendations for different facets of the commercial sector. And I just included a little quote there that illustrates around a recommendation about toys. But the point is that we really need to work collectively and think creatively to challenge what is a very long-standing problem. Thank you for listening.
Right, sorry, before anyone was going to say you're muted, because I was getting the, God forbid. Thank you so much, Becky. That was that was a really great way to kick off this panel, and I think it is incredibly useful to give us a sense of the status of how things are now and what can be done. And I think that's really useful. And then hopefully in our discussion, we can kind of start to think, pick out a bit more of what perhaps might be prioritised in terms of bringing about change. And thanks for that flashback to the Power Rangers. I thought I'd escape those from when my kids were small. Yeah, thanks for that. That'll be in my head now for quite some time, especially the little skirts on the women. Anyway, right, okay, thanks so much. So we're going to move on now to our second speaker, and that's Professor Stephanie Spencer. And having Becky so eloquently given us a sense of the status now and what's happening now, and Stephanie is going to provide a historical context, because obviously this is an issue that we have been experiencing for, ever. So that perhaps might be not very historical, but Stephanie can put me right. So Stephanie's, and I'm sorry, Becky, I didn't give the title of your section, but Stephanie's title is, she will need patience in overcoming difficulties, a century of educational progress, and the legacy of post-war gender stereotyping. So this will give us a really great insight into the context of some of these issues and help us try to think about the present and how to solve some of these problems. So just Stephanie, if I can introduce her. So Stephanie is Professor of the History of Women's Education at the University of Winchester. And she teaches on the Education Studies degree that is designed for students who have an interest in the academic study of education. Graduates on that degree go on to teach many who study the subject as a way of exploring the way that gender, race and social class intersect. And I think intersectionality is something that's going to crop up a lot on our discussions. So the way in which gender, race and social class intersect in both policy making and the experience of formal education. And she's particularly interested in the factors external to the formal curriculum that have affected girls' career choices. Her recent book with Nancy G. Rostov is on British and American school stories from 1910 to 1960, fiction, femininity and friendship. And that won the 2020 Anne Bloomfield Book Prize. Well done, Stephanie. For the best book in English on the history of education. Wow, that's impressive. And it focused on the role of leisure regarding as informal education. And there's a really nice link there with what Becky was saying about playground. That what happens at school doesn't just happen inside the classroom, it happens in the corridors and in the playground. So that's really interesting. And her new research focus is on the Girls Direct Grant Schools, 1944 to 1976. So it's a very great pleasure to hand over to Stephanie.
Thank you, Kate. I'm now going to attempt to share my screen. Not quite sure why. Is that sharing?
No, at the moment.
Yet. Not yet.
No. There's always somebody who can't do it, isn't there? Entire screen. How about that?
Yeah.
Hooray. Right, thank you, Kate. That's it. I am actually going to pick up quite almost seamlessly from Becky and go backwards, because there are so many things that came up in Becky's talk that we can see emerging from over the last 100 years, and particularly in the post-war period. So what I'm going to do is offer a brief overview of some of the legislation and government reports that are relevant to girls' education since 1921, and that in theory chart an opening up of professional opportunity. I then reflect on the origins and tenacity of negative stereotypes that returned after the experience of World War II had shown that thousands of women were capable of and apparently enjoyed all aspects of engineering, from design to manufacturing. So in 1921, in England and Wales, a majority of children just attended a state elementary school that provided a basic 3 hours education and then led straight into work at the age of 14. Very few went to grammar school that would then lead to university. Even fewer girls went to university, with many choosing to sign the pledge to teach that gave them remission from their fees. Technical schools existed, but they were few and far between, especially those catering for girls. The report on the differentiation of the curriculum in 1923 concluded that girls and boys were equal in ability, but their psychological makeup rendered girls more susceptible to emotional fatigue, overstrain, and physical weakness. Haddow, on the education of the adolescent in 1926, recommended that trade schools and junior technical schools should be provided where there was local demand. But that from industry, so technical education was really seen as an industrial rather than education responsibility. Now, Spence in 1938 was on secondary grammar and technical education, and it recommended the inclusion of technical schools as one arm of a tripartite secondary system alongside academic grammar and practical secondary modern schools. And you can see from this quote that they recognise the very broad range of opportunities that technical education could lead to. They're very clear that it's very wide, and they are explicit that the junior technical schools, based on the engineering industry, provide the broad educational foundation suitable for the pupil whose intention is no more definitely expressed than by his saying, in effect, when I leave school, I think I'd like to be an engineer of some sort. And the report continued that the schools provided a specific approach to science that was about the first-hand knowledge of the application of science to the processes of manufacture and the operation of devices. But already girls were at a disadvantage because there were far fewer girls' technical schools in existence, and they had an extremely gendered curriculum. So by 1944, free state secondary education for everybody in a school leaving age of 15 was introduced, and most local education authorities did establish the tripartite system. But the hierarchy of occupations that resulted from these schools quickly meant that grammar schools were seen as the gold standard and technical schools were relegated to second place, despite aspirations for parity of esteem. Girls' technical education seems to have been focused on textiles, catering, nursing, and secretarial. And girls' grammar schools tended to have poor science facilities. And again, the tiny amount of girls who went to university went to humanities. By the 1960s, the tripartite system, as we know, was replaced by comprehensives, but the damage already seems to have been done, and streaming in most schools put technical subjects lower down the hierarchy, and girls drifted towards the more domestic side of technical work. The 1988 Education Act laid down the national curriculum and key stages that meant that all boys and girls had equal access, and this really should have marked the end of limited access according to your gender. But the gold standard of academic A levels still put technical subjects down the list, and boys did sciences and girls did arts. Tomlinson attempted to introduce diplomas that included a range of subjects that mixed technical and academic subjects, but it was doomed to fail as the weight of public opinion demanded the retention of the academic A levels. So it remains to be seen whether the current T-level initiative will finally break the gender barriers. So while opportunities for girls in engineering careers have improved, the combination of technical subjects as low status and maths and science as gendered seem to mitigate against girls' participation. But the overview of educational change doesn't satisfactorily explain the gender differential in the choice to embark on apprenticeships or degrees after 1944. So looking at so now I want to look at the experience of the decade immediately after the war to see if we can see where some of these stereotypes appeared. In 1945, Gertrude Williams in Women and Work set out the problems that beset girls' career choice. Men and women are different because of the different parts they have to play, and think that this is immediately after the war when they have been playing a whole range of parts. And her point was they have to produce the next generation, and she effectively dismisses engineering Many kinds of employment are outside women's scope because they demand a skill or accumulation of experience which is not thought worth her while to acquire. And she concludes, rearing babies through happy, healthy childhood to independent maturity is even more important than wiring aeroplanes and is a very much more absorbing and exciting task. And although Women's Employment, the publication, asserted that who is more interested in the problems of ventilation in homes, schools, shops, factories and public buildings than a woman, who's more vitally concerned with new and better ways of heating her home than a housewife, and suggested that engineering is a career that did not have to end with marriage and could be carried on while acquiring a family, they were very much a minority voice. Careers advice books were either for girls or for boys, and they proliferated in the 50s. And while engineering was included, the nature of the training and context of the workplace created problems. The title of the talk, She Will Need Patience in Overcoming Difficulties, comes from the 1953 Careers and Vocational Training for Girls. And coping with engineering was going to be just too much for girls because of all the male prejudice. And by 1957, the message was clearly getting through, as only 326 girls took on one of over 24,000 apprenticeships in engineering, shipbuilding and electrical work. At the annual conference of assistant mistresses in 1957, a talk on opportunities for and training of girls in technology told the conference that a course for girl technicians only attracted one applicant. And this was the reason that the one applicant gave for why her friends were not interested. And we also see that in the same talk, he said that the Women's Engineering Society ensured that engineering was offered as an option. The door is open wide, but nobody seems to be beckoning the girls to come in. And in the publication Technical Education, Catherine Ollenshaw was also ambivalent. As you can see, the position in engineering is not too favourable for girls. There's prejudice against the employment of women in the machine shop floor. The training's long and the work can be, but is not necessarily dirty. And there's few facilities for part-time work. So again, implicit in that is that you're not going to be in the workplace for very long. In addition to formal careers advice, popular career novels were published at this point to appeal to a teenage audience, and these always included romance and an explanation of how the chosen career would fit with marriage. And in Electronics is one of the last in the series and is the only engineering representative in over 100 publications. The last chapter sees Anne, after 5 years as a member of the Women's Engineering Society and a responsible member of the development department. And this is a longer quote from Nigel when he proposes to Anne, and it's made very clear that he wants her to stay as a career engineer. You're a clever engineer, Anne, and I hope you always will be, he concludes. But negative attitudes continued into the 1960s and 70s. In 1975, Ross Davis observed that marriage is still seen as the high point of a girl's life and a career as somehow lack of commitment to that role. In 1971, only 7.5% of girls entered apprenticeships, and those were mostly hairdressing. 39% of boys went into apprenticeships. So despite opportunities, it appears that the inclination by employers, parents, teachers and girls themselves was that the feminine character prevented entry into the engineering profession. And if we recognise that the stereotype that girls were not cut out for engineering careers emerged very quickly in the post-war decades in line with welfare state expectations, and if we can recognise that the expectations of women's work patterns, domestic divisions of labour and childcare provision are no longer those of the 1950s, then it might be possible to finally consign Gertrude Williams' statement that, by and large, it's true to say that still skilled occupations are outside women's scope, and we can send that to its historical context. Thank you.
That was brilliant. Thank you so much. I'm just sorry, my pictures have just been there we are. Sorry, thank you so much, Stephanie. That's a beautiful, succinct overview of this. Yeah, so this really kind of very embedded perception around gender roles and appropriate careers and appropriate education. And yeah, and I'm all for consigning various gendered and historical roles to the I don't know, the graveyard or whatever. Yeah, absolutely. So hopefully we can come back and think in our discussion. And I would encourage everyone attending. Again, thank you so much for attending. If you have any comments or any questions, put them into the Q&A. But if you want to share your experiences, some of you may have yourselves experienced this kind of gendered advice at school around careers. Please do feel free to share those life experiences with us you can put those into the chat if you like, and then any specific questions perhaps into the Q&A, so that we can start trying to figure out how to fix this. If we are proper engineers, we should be fixing things, so perhaps we could fix this problem. Anyway, right, so we shall move along now to our next speaker. And our next speaker, it's wonderful to have Linda. Linda is a former colleague at London South Bank University, so it's lovely to have Linda back. And Linda's been involved, I think, in celebrating this year, marking 100 years of LSBU teaching engineering, which dates right back to 1921, where Stephanie very helpfully began her presentation. So Linda Edwards Shea, she graduated in applied physics from Lancaster Polytechnic, which is now Coventry University. And after working as a research engineer with British Aerospace and as a desk editor for the LSBU Scientific Publishing Company, she went on to gain a master's degree in applied optics from Imperial College. She worked in research for the GEC Hurst Research Centre before joining London South Bank University as a lecturer in the Faculty of Engineering. And Linda is now a professional actor and playwright. So it's going to be fascinating to learn. And I picked up on one of the slides that Stephanie showed about the engineering training, that it was also artistic. And I think this is something you very strongly are passionate about kind of discussing. So we look forward to that. The title of Linda's paper is, where is the title? Oh yeah, sorry, Science versus Art. Sorry, obviously. Science versus Arts, the Fake Divide, which just sounds wonderful. So I shall hand over now to Linda.
Thank you very much, Kate, for your lovely introduction. As Kate's just said, I was employed at London South Bank University teaching physics to electrical and electronic engineering students. I was also co-founder of the Women in Engineering Centre, and I ran a women-only electronic engineering course. I should say from the outset that I left about 20 years ago and trained as an actor. However, I kept my interest in engineering education by tutoring and doing occasional consultancy. My experience as a scientist moving into the performing arts has made me think a lot about the expectations put upon girls and women and boys and men in terms of their career choices, which is why my talk today is called Science versus Art, the Fake Divide. It's long been known that girls and boys choose their A-level subjects according to gendered norms. And there's plenty of research to back this up, as we've already heard. For example, an article in the Times Educational Supplement in September 2020 titled A-Levels, Boys Shun English as Girls Avoid Physics. So that's 2020, it's still going on. There are many other examples of articles and academic papers written about this gender divide. It is not a new divide. I'm going to start off by talking about myself and my own education history. I was choosing my A-level subjects in the early 1970s. I had a widowed mum and knew it would be up to me to earn a decent living in the future. I well remember my mum's mantra that she would repeat, be financially independent. I entered my A-level years with her mantra ringing in my ears, and I knew one thing for certain. I wanted to earn a decent living and did not want to rely on a man for money. I decided I'd be a scientist because they have good jobs. So I chose to study biology, chemistry, pure maths, and applied maths at A level. Notice the absence of physics from the list. I should note in passing that science subjects were not my best. I was much better at art and English literature. I was passionate about literature, especially Shakespeare and poetry, but I also enjoyed science classes, especially the practical classes. So for me, it was a straight choice between art and science. I chose science for the simple reason that I wanted a decent job at the end of my education. I decided I wanted to be a biologist. In other words, I chose what's called girls' science. As it happens, I gave up studying maths after a term and replaced the maths subjects with physics. I was very reluctant to do so, but by then I'd discovered I'm an ill-disciplined mathematician, and it dawned on me that I didn't know what I was doing in maths. However, I still wanted to be a biologist, so I chose another science subject to make sure of a university place to study biology. The obvious choice was physics. In those days, it was well known that to study medicine, the desired A-level subjects were biology, chemistry, and physics. And I was toying with the idea of going into a biomedical career, something about which I knew absolutely nothing. Choosing to study physics at school was difficult. It was a girls' school, so I didn't have to suffer the problem of being coerced by boys. But even so, I was told I'd grow facial hair. I was told I'd turn into a man. The nonsense I heard from my classmates was laughable. In my head, I knew they were just being thoughtless, but in my heart, I wanted to conform. I did not want to be regarded as a weirdo or a geek or a freak. However, I stuck to my plan and moved on to the A-level physics course. On the first day in class, my physics teacher, Mr. White, turned to me as I walked in and he said, "Oh, good, I always wanted you in my class." I've never forgotten those words, and I will be eternally grateful to Mr. White for saying them. To cut a long story short, I went on to become a physicist. What's telling about my experience at school, however, is that I did my A-levels 48 years ago. In those days, girls were not expected to go to university, never mind earn a living from science. A tiny proportion of university students studying the physical sciences were female. These days, however, the gender split for university entrance is about 50-50. What's startling in this day and age is that the gender split in A-level choice still exists, and women are still underrepresented in the physical sciences, especially physics and engineering. Girls and women are still choosing gendered careers. Sadly, as we all know, one of the factors leading to the gendered pay gap and the gendered pension gap is the differential in pay between men and women. Why do nurses earn less than doctors? Why do women working in retail earn less than men working in construction? These are profound questions. Here's another one, a favorite of mine. Why do people think physics is difficult? In an article titled "Gender Gaps in A-Level Subjects, the Full List," written in 2015 by John Dickens and published in Schools Week, he reports Ofsted figures showing that only 10% of pupils taking computing at AS level were girls, and girls made up just 22% of pupils taking physics. He goes on to say, the figures show a role reversal for subjects including sociology, psychology, and art and design. Similar articles with the same findings are published year on year as researchers examine A-level choices. Looking at the gender differences in girls' A-level choices today in 2021, I wonder how we have failed to do something about this gender problem. Despite countless schemes and initiatives to encourage girls into studying STEM subjects, we have failed. Since I became an actor, I've been asked many times how it feels going from a physics career into the arts. I always say I haven't noticed a massive change in what I do because both are creative. In my mind, I've gone from one creative art into another creative art. creating something new using my physics knowledge and skill feels to me like the process of inventing and finding a character in a play. They are both acts of creativity. Look around at our world. We're surrounded by objects and ideas that have been created by physicists, engineers, mathematicians, and technologists. The physical sciences are creative. Engineering is creative. I need to mention the perceptions about what girls and boys are good at. Society believes boys and men are good at hard subjects like science and engineering, and girls and women are good at soft subjects like art, English, and the humanities. Note the adjectives hard and soft, designed to foster deeply entrenched societal roles. Why do we want girls to be soft and boys to be hard? Does this divide serve us well? It clearly doesn't serve women well when we look at the gender pay gap. How is creativity perceived by school students and their teachers? In my experience, engineering students at the start of their university courses don't consider engineering to be creative at all, despite all the evidence to the contrary. Public perceptions and the way the arts and sciences are written about don't help. For example, the Cambridge Assessment website published an article called "Celebrating the Arts, 5 Reasons to Study Creative Subjects." The subjects referred to are art, music, and drama. To be fair to the author, the school subject design and technology is also mentioned. I don't dispute that these subjects are creative. Of course they are, but they are not the only creative subjects. It would appear from the plethora of data confirming the gender gap in A-level choices that girls are opting for traditional art subjects in much larger numbers than boys do. A consequence of this is that girls choose A-level subjects that do not get them onto the university courses they're aiming for. A classic example is medicine. The traditional A-level combination to study medicine is biology, chemistry, and physics. Over the years, there have been widely reported stories in the press about brilliant female students failing to be accepted onto prestigious medical courses, leading to a general outcry from the public. On closer inspection of those stories, it becomes clear that the brilliant female student has not studied physics at A-level. Why are brilliant female students opting not to do physics at A-level? Is it really that hard? Why do we promote the idea that to study physics or to be a physicist, you need to be a genius? I think this is a notion put about by male physicists. I've met several who think like that. An article published in Science Daily in October 2020, titled "Which is More Creative, the Arts or the Sciences?" is valuable reading. It summarizes the research findings of Professor David Cropley and Kim van Broekhoven, who explored the nature of creativity and determining if specific differences exist between creativity in the sciences and creativity in the arts. They concluded that creativity in science, technology, engineering, and maths is very similar to creativity in the arts, indicating that a holistic approach to teaching creativity in schools and universities would benefit everyone. It's widely accepted that creativity is a skill or mindset that future employees will need in future industries. Is this the lure that will attract female students to physics and engineering? If it is, then we need to make sure that we tell girls, their teachers, their parents, and their brothers that creativity is not confined to the traditional arts. If girls want to choose creative subjects at A-level, then it's up to us to make sure that STEM subjects are included on that list. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you so much, Linda. And you've raised so many important issues there that I hope that we will have some time to discuss more. I mean, I particularly, you've made me really think that if we're trying to kind of trying to fix this problem, as I said earlier, is that it's not just gender stereotyping that is the issue. It's the framing and presentation of subjects. And this, you know, how many meetings do I sit in? I have to say here at LSBU, and I hear soft and hard for subjects, you know, and social sciences, which I'm in, are soft subjects. And then we've got engineering, you know, it's hard subject, and it drives me mad, and others mad as well. So it's brilliant that you've alluded to that in such a clever way, in an interesting way. And then you also made me think back to an experience. I used to teach a sociology module on gender and society and equality in a room in the basement of Borough Road, which you'll know, it's one of the buildings here at LSBU. And that was a 2-hour lecture, and then the class would file out. It was predominantly women, I have to say, with female students, and then we'd file out, and there was the next class was waiting to come in, and it was all, I think, apart from 2 women, it was all men. There was about 40 of them. And it didn't take, you know, a huge genius to work out that this was, I don't know if it was engineering, but it was certainly, it was either, I think it was some form of engineering subject. And myself and the other lecturer, we just laughed and sort of said, so yeah, I'm teaching sociology. What are you teaching? So that was only a year or 2 ago. So many things to think about there and to discuss. But we shall move on to our last speaker on this stellar panel that we have. And that is so Linda's a former colleague, and we have one of our wonderful current colleagues, which is our archivist, our fantastic archivist, Ruth McLeod, who is a co-curator of this project with also our absent colleague, Claire Benson, who will eventually watch this when she wakes up, because she's in New Zealand. And I don't know if she's awake or morning, I have no idea of the time zone. But so Ruth has worked on this project from the outset, and has not only curated the events that we've been holding, but also a wonderful web page, which I will put the link into the chat in a moment once Ruth starts. And on that, as well as information about this project and the celebration of 100 years of LSBU teaching engineering, Ruth has picked out from the archive profiles of a number of both students and teachers who have been involved in the teaching of engineering, and some wonderful stories there in those biographies. And one includes Claire herself, Claire Benson, our colleague, is as a former student. So I put the link in, and then if you're interested, you can take a look at that great website and look at some of our bios. Right, okay, so without further ado, I shall introduce Ruth. So as I said, Ruth is our archivist here at LSBU, and she is responsible for the care of the university's historic records. This includes helping with search of our institutional history and bringing it to a wider audience. And that's why she's played such a pivotal role in this centenary year around women in engineering. And as I said, I'll put the links into the website so you can take a look. And I think Ruth is going to give us an insight into what actually is in the archive. So we'll be looking forward to that. All right, thanks, Ruth.
I will now do the classic, try and get my slides up. There we go, of course. Right, so I'm going to talk a little bit this evening about the history of women's education at LSBU. There'll be a bit of a focus on women in engineering, because that's what we've been going into in depth over the last 18 months or so, that we've been kind of researching and looking into the background of this project. And obviously extending out our research into women more widely hasn't been the easiest thing to do in the last 12 months. I've got some additional stuff, but it's maybe not as comprehensive as I'd like it to be. And also I've only got 10 minutes. So I'm gonna just talk a little bit about some of the things we found out from the project, and specifically about teaching women engineering at LSBU, and then tell you a couple of the stories we've got about our students and staff and some of the things that we've done, and just try and kind of give an overview of all of it. So LSBU was founded as the Borough Polytechnic in 1892. So this is a slide with a couple of pages from our very first prospectus. If you can read the right-hand page, the small print at the top says, the object of the classes is to provide sound instruction for young men and women residing in and about South London, thus promoting industrial skill and general knowledge by the following means. So they talk about how they're going to promote industrial skill and general knowledge. So that shows that we're very definitely founded to educate both men and women. And the subjects and skills training offered were slightly more gendered. We had very trade-based skills offerings, but we had other subjects which we encouraged everyone to do, which were a bit more kind of broad, things like languages and music and drama, the kind of general knowledge aspects of it that this talk about. But the industrial skills definitely a very gendered aspect. And also in the archive, we've got a couple of books which date from the 1910s, which are called Trades for London Girls and Trades for London Boys. And as you can see, this for the girls includes domestic economy schools, schools of arts and crafts, domestic service, clothing trades, and the boys is, building trades, designing, leather trades, metal trades. So you can see there's very definite differences in what boys and girls were being encouraged into. And that was actually reflected in the courses that we were teaching a lot of the time as well. But as time moved on, you get to 1920. So immediately after the First World War, in 1919, the Women's Engineering Society came to the Borough Polytechnic and they said, will you admit women to your full-time engineering courses? And slightly embarrassingly for a talk about women's education, we said, no, we won't. But we will allow women who are working or had worked in engineering, we will allow them to be admitted to our evening classes on the same basis as men. They couldn't do the full-time day classes, but they could do the evening classes. And so in 1920, our women's department, this is their page in the prospectus on the left-hand side, they advertised that women could study subjects in other departments. And one of those departments was engineering. And they specifically said that you could do classes in machine and technical drawing suitable for women tracers. And for petrol motor classes, which include the thing being a chauffeur, which sounds kind of fun actually. So this is in 1920, which is why 2021 is the centenary year. And at that point, only one of these people, only one woman signed up. Rather horrifyingly, my thing that was supposed to be highlighting her name has actually blanked her out. It didn't do that in the other version of this I had. That's rather awkward. There was only one woman in the engineering class. Her name was Ida, and rather satisfying, she got the highest average mark in the class, and she got something like 80% overall, which was the highest mark. And the image on the far right of this slide should show you the totals of people in this class. There's 70 people in the class. She's the only woman. And so that shows you a little bit, quite a sobering demonstration of what she's actually up against at that point. Ida is one of the profiles that we wrote up on our website, so you can find out a little bit more about her and what she was doing before she came to us, what we think she did afterwards. So I encourage you to go and have a look at that. It's quite an interesting story. But as time goes on, we obviously realised that more women were starting to do these engineering subjects, so we started offering slightly different courses. This is 1930, where we offered simplified engineering for women and electricity in the home. So simplified engineering for women was taught separately to the men's courses. I haven't been able to get the exact figures for how many women studied this, because the annual reports and the write-ups about how the course was going and the exam registers, which give the women's actual names, don't actually marry up perfectly. So I need to kind of go back through them and try and work out exactly how many women did these things at different points. But I do know that after 1 year, we stopped segregating the classes because it was clear that the women were doing just fine. So we started teaching them alongside the men. They did a reduced syllabus. They didn't do as many classes as the men did, but they were being taught alongside them. And frequently, they were doing very well and winning prizes in the class. Electricity in the home was essentially basic electrical engineering for women so that they'd be able to manage their electricity in their own house and also to work and doing things like demonstrating electrical appliances. There was a real shift in the 1920s to offering very practical courses. We also offered a course in what we called household jobbing, which is essentially DIY for women. It was how to make sure your gas works, how to fix a shelf, how to do all of these useful things that maybe women who previously only lived with their parents or with men, and suddenly there weren't as many men around, they were being taught how to do these very practical subjects. And these two courses actually form a part of that as well. So obviously, having discovered all of these courses, we wanted to find out a little bit as part of this wider Centenary project about who some of these women were, you know, who did these courses, what happened to them, where did they go? And the only way we could actually discover any of that information was by looking through our exam registers to try and work out how many of them did the courses. Our early student records haven't survived. They only exist from 1948 onwards. So the only way we could identify any of these women was to trawl through our exam registers. So what I did was I then popped that into a graph to show how many women did things at any given point. And this is roughly the first 50 years that we taught women engineering subjects, and kind of shows how the balance of numbers went. And it is quite a rough figure. It's not 100% accurate. It's only meant to be kind of indicative. Some of the classifications of subjects are a little bit vague. Television, for example, has been lumped into electrical engineering, which may have been a surprise to the women who were studying it at the time. You can see a high point for engineering drawing. That was 1939-40, and that was what we called a lady tracers course. Gradually that petered out. In fact, you can see it's got quite a dramatic drop off after that. That's partly because we stopped offering it as a standalone. So it then got folded into mechanical engineering and electrical engineering more widely. You will see, obviously, some years have no women at all. When we were looking through the exam registers, we did refer to these as the Brian years, because there were usually more men called Brian studying engineering in those years than there were women. I now like this phrase and will be using it as often as possible, because I think it's quite indicative of how women's education may have been at those points. We've also got a very detailed set of statistics for the 1950s, which break down a little bit more about not just roughly how many women were doing subjects, but some of their backgrounds, some of their student backgrounds, and also things like sandwich courses and placements. So I've pulled together this for it, which shows you roughly the kind of balance of men and women doing these different things at different points. One of them is figures for the evening students who are in employment, and you can see the difference there. It's pretty stark. Men, 3,298. Women, 686. It's a massive difference. Day release students, again, over 2,000 men, 303 women. But that does tend to start to vary slightly when you look at the different subjects that people are being day released from. So for the food trades, it's 179 versus 63. It's still more men, but it's not quite such a big difference. Nursing, 5 men, 207 women. So that tells you quite a lot about how gendered a lot of these subjects were. Chemical things, 7 women are on day release, but it's 106 men. And then we get to electrical engineering, where it's 487 men and 2 women. Obviously, full-time students is a slightly different breakdown, and part-time students, again, it's a slightly different breakdown. These are very specifically just the ones who are on day release. But realizing that there were only 2 women on day release doing day release sounds like from prison, sorry, doing day release courses on electrical engineering in 1954-55 made me realize that we could probably find out a little bit about who they were. So I went and looked to find out which women were doing things, and I found Edna Evelyn Tiger. You can see the little note beside her name. It says PTD, which means she's part-time day student. I had to get in touch with our student records team to see if they could tell me anything else about her, and it shows that she was a recording engineer for the BBC throughout her course. She later married a fellow BBC engineer, and they lived in St John's Wood. I like to think that she was based around Marylebone and St John's Wood and the BBC, that maybe she worked at somewhere like Maid Vale and got to use everything in the studios there, but that is entirely fantasy on my part, because the BBC staff record archives don't cover engineers, so I've got no idea anything else about her. But she is one of only 2 women who are being effectively sponsored through their course at this point. So I think it's worth a mention. I also want to talk a little bit about our staff. Now, I could say a lot about staff. We've got some absolutely brilliant information from the dressmaking lecturer, who's Miss Court, whose image is on the left, who had to design when she got married in the 1920s, and all the way up to a member of staff in the 1970s who told me that one of her colleagues made it clear to her when she started that it wasn't anything personal, but he didn't approve of women in the workplace. So it obviously hasn't entirely been plain sailing for our staff or for our students. There's been a lot of different hurdles to overcome, some of which may have been institutional and some of which are more to do with just expectations. That's something we've been talking about quite a lot already this evening. But I also want to tell a positive story. So the image on the right-hand side comes from our governing body minutes, which reported on all our new hires, which is very handy when you're trying to work out who started working for us and when. This is Miss CMH Maddox. This is Carol Maddox. She was a former student of the Polytechnic. She'd won prizes while she was one of our students and came top of her class frequently. And in 1963, she became our very first female mechanical engineering lecturer. So it's a bit of a first in many ways there. She was the first to teach engineering, but she wasn't actually the first lecturer in a STEM subject. That was Eileen Bilderwell, who lectured in maths from 1948. She was then promoted to our senior lecturer in statistics in 1965. Slightly frustratingly, and in a way that often happens, the best source of information I've been able to find for her outside of her work at the Borough Polytechnic is her husband's obituary, which is deeply frustrating, but is a frequent issue when you're trying to do any kind of women's history, is that the men are much better reported. But within 5 years of Carol Maddox's appointment, there were two other women lecturing in mechanical engineering, Patricia Ashcroft and H. Williams. At that point, the complete staff for mechanical engineering totaled about 30 people. So there were still only 10% of the staff, and our other STEM departments are still pretty low in women at that point. Very briefly, as I kind of come to an end, I haven't got a slide for this section, but Southbank had the first woman head of an electrical engineering department in the UK, Professor Agnes Capozzi, who was appointed in 1976. I actually got to talk to her a couple of weeks ago and had an absolutely brilliant conversation. It's going to be one of our profiles in June when we're marking International Day of Engineering. She estimated that they had about 50 full-time staff in electrical engineering in the early 1980s. About 15 of those were women. And there was a survey done in the 1980s where they were asked if they'd applied to Southbank because we had a woman head of department. And they said yes, a lot of them had, because they thought that they'd get a fair hearing in their interviews because it was a woman who was in charge. From Professor Capozzi's point of view, she felt that she'd appointed them because they were the best. And I think that actually ties in a lot with what we've been talking about this evening, that if we don't look at if we look outside of the stereotypes, we can smash them, and we can do women can do pretty much what we like. So thank you very much. Do have a look at the website, that's the link there, and have a look at our Twitter.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ruth. Yeah, and I put the links to the and yeah, your omission of Ida, I thought was rather symbolic of women being written out of history.
It was fine on the other version. That's very embarrassing. But the image is on the website, so you can go and look at it there instead.
Poor Ida, she would be very displeased. So I put the direct link to her profile into the chat if people want to have a look. So thank you very much to all our speakers. What we're going to do now is have a bit of a sort of panel discussion, but we would love to have some any questions or comments or contributions from those of you who are our guests. Sorry, the audience. That was the word I was looking for. But I thought I'd start off, if okay, and to ask each of our panelists. Usually, this is the kind of question you get at the end of something like this. But I thought it actually might be kind of interesting if I ask this question at the beginning, and then we can kind of perhaps discuss it. So for each of you, I wondered what is it? Is there one thing or kind of key priority do you think would be most useful in terms of trying to end this idea around gender stereotyping, which all of you have talked about in kind of slightly different contexts? We realize the historical context of it. So despite LSBU doing this, quite wonderful thing of teaching women engineering from 1921, which is great, but we still, I mean, I have some data here, data from 2017-18, shows that the percentage of women studying STEM subjects, so science, what is STEM? Science, technology, engineering and maths. I think, yes, sorry. Whew. Okay, thank you. And STEM subject. So the data from 2017-18 is that in UK universities, it's 35% of women are studying those subjects, and for engineering and technology subjects, it's 19%. So even though we're 100 years down the road, you know, in terms of, we're still not, you know, reaching parity at all. So I just wondered if, and I know I'm kind of putting you on the spot, but if each of you perhaps, you know, from your experience, think, is there one or two things that you think we should prioritize to try and smash this gender stereotype with regards to education and careers once and for all? Don't know who wants to pitch in. Will I do it in order that you, yeah, Linda, thank you.
Just following on from Ruth mentioning Professor Agnes Capozzi at London South Bank University. I joined LSBU because she was the head of department. I had students coming in to study at LSBU because we had more female lecturers and more female technicians than any other university in the United Kingdom. We still didn't have loads of female students, but we had some. We had enough to open the Women in Engineering Centre, for example. There was very much a drive to get more female students. Unfortunately, she left and was replaced by a very mediocre man, which is often the case. We have to accept the fact that mediocre men can do very, very well in engineering. I hate to say it, but it's true. Why is that? We have to tackle this at the core, and really we're talking about, you know, centuries of sexism here. We have to say the sexism word. But one thing we can do about it, I think, is to do what South Bank did then. Hire female heads of department, hire female lecturers, hire female technicians, and treat them with respect. Promote them, treat them properly, treat them as you would the men. And then I think that will be a start to resolve the problem.
Thank you. And anyone else like to, well, I'll go around. I don't know who wants to go to, it's like one of my seminars, sorry, making everyone, you will all speak. Becky.
Yeah, I think it's actually a really challenging question, and this was that obviously reflected the huge raft of kind of recommendations for everybody that we had at the end of the Fawcett Commission. The fundamental point is about the construction of gender difference, which we're all inculcated in, and of course is incredibly seductive and bound up with our identities. So very, very hard to challenge, and really needs this sort of holistic approach that I was talking about. But I think we just have to carry on with it. The encouragement and the pressure and the campaigning for things not to be constructed as for girls or for boys, but open to everybody. And that message has to seep through at every level. I think to that end, some structural elements are really important. And I can't remember who it was, but one of you made the point about the introduction of the national curriculum. Now, I remember thanks Stephanie, as a doctoral student at that time, that had been terribly unpopular with the profession, basically, the introduction of a national curriculum. But it transformed girls' results within years, because basically it forced girls to take then O-levels in maths and STEM in a way that previously they just hadn't done. It didn't, interestingly, have necessarily the same impacts on boys' English and language, and that's where they continue to sort of comparatively underperform. But nevertheless, the point about keeping options and horizons open and equitable for as long as possible, I think is really important structurally. And finally then, I just want to support Linda's point about modelling, and for me as an educationalist, this would also be about resources, just showing whether it's girls into STEM or whether it's boys into caring professions, language, subjects and so forth, being able to exemplify that actually sort of non-gender stereotypical people have been present in those occupations for a very long time, but often hidden, and being able to exemplify the art of the possible. You know, again, Linda's inspirational remarks about what motivated her to think that this was a route available to her, I think are really powerful takeaways.
Yeah, thank you, excellent, thanks. I don't, Stephanie or Ruth, I don't know if you want to have any comments. Yeah. Stephanie, yeah.
Yes, I mean, I think what struck me, what I found was very disappointing, was that when the Tomlinson report came out that was trying to break that, the way that arts and technical subjects were just kept so separately. And then the idea that the great gold standard A level might disappear, public opinion just completely flattened the idea before it had even got off the drawing board. And I think it shows the strength of public perception about who does what subject, which I thought Linda's talk was just great, because it really does sort of speak to the possibility of developing creativity, whatever you choose to do. It seems to me that there are two problems. There's two problems. One is that engineering and STEM subjects are seen as difficult, and the other one is that they're not very feminine. So there's a kind of double whammy going on. So I'm not sure whether we need sort of Barbie does engineering or something for the little ones. You know, I mean, I know that's very tongue in cheek, but it's also about, although it's great to provide role models for women who seem to do everything, who seem to be able to manage careers and children and still rise to the top of the profession, I think part of the publicity that needs to go is that these careers are, you don't have to climb a ladder, you don't have to be a leader, they can be ordinary careers, in the same way that people see I'm trying to think what maybe teaching is seen as an ordinary career, something that anybody can have a crack at, may not be very good at, but at least there's the opportunity to have a go at. So I think it's about hearts and minds very much. And it's, I mean, interestingly, my daughter always wanted to be a medic. We have no medics in the family, and her attitude was that she didn't want to faff about with the arts and arts subjects, because sciences you could just do and you knew whether they were right or wrong, and she never wavered from that. We thought it was maybe because she'd been watching too much television with the role models on Casualty and that sort of thing. I don't know. It's slightly garbled, but really I think it is about trying to appeal to a wider range of ability, that you don't have Linda's thing about physics isn't difficult. I'm not sure I would agree with that from the way I was taught physics, but to make it more accessible.
Thanks, Stephanie. And yeah, so you just made me think about the teaching of these subjects as well in schools. And I'm thinking, you know, right down to the early years, but I went to an all-girls school, and I have to say the standard of science and maths teaching was really poor compared to other subjects. Yeah, so I think there's teaching issues as well. Ruth, did you? We do have a question, but I was going to. Ruth, do you want to? I was wondering, maybe from the profiles, all the great work that you've been doing researching the profiles, is there any kind of, I don't know, common theme between the women who did come to LSBU?
I think one of the things that came up quite strongly is that quite a lot of them vanish a couple of years into their career for whatever reason. So I could trace some of them through the records of the Women's Engineering Society, but some of them, the last appearance of one of them, who was married before she came to us, the last appearance of her in anything for the Women's Engineering Society was when she had children. There's a note that she'd had her first baby. I think that was in the 50s, early 50s. I can't remember exactly which one she was in, because everyone crossed decades. And I think about flexibility in careers later on in life as well, and knowing that that's an option. But for encouraging women to do so, I mean, I didn't do any A-levels because I'm Scottish. You do a much broader range of things. And our physics teacher was absolutely brilliant, which is why, much to my surprise and possibly his, I passed my higher physics exam. But I would say that one of the things you actually need for that is the role models early on. If you are the kind of child, especially the kind of girl who reads a lot of, say, Enid, which would probably be encouraged for many reasons, but it's bad for the girls to like maths. It's not girly to like maths in things like Enid Blyton, the kind of traditional girls' school stories and stuff. I think that's quite telling. I think the more that the role models that people get through books and telly diversify what their female role models do and what they can like, the better it will be for them to think, well, it's okay to be good at maths and science. And then people will do more and more of that as they go on. Because I think what Linda said about Professor Kaposi being like a role model for staff and students, I think the more you can get that filtered through a range of different culture is probably a good thing.
Good, thank you. And we do have a sort of a comment, but perhaps some of you might want to kind of to comment on the comment. And this is from Kate. Thanks for sending us this comment. So she argues that engineering in the UK doesn't have the same prestige of other professions. And as a result, girls are encouraged to raise their aspirations. They tend to go for medicine or the law instead of engineering. I wonder if that's something, I don't know, Linda, perhaps if you think that does that resonate with you?
Yes, I've come across that a lot over the years, and it's true. If we compare ourselves to Germany, for instance, in Germany, if you are the equivalent of a chartered engineer, i.e. you have a professional license to practice as an engineer, you have the name engineer in your title. So it might be Dr. Mrs. Engineer or something like that. It's actually part of your title. And it's not only that, but here in the UK, there's huge public ignorance about engineering, despite the best efforts of our fantastic engineering institutions. And I must admit, I don't know why that is. I think it's because chartered engineers, i.e. professional engineers at the top of the engineering tree, don't go around telling people that they're professional engineers. And then we have like technician engineers. There's a ladder, like with any career. If it's law, medicine, for instance, you can be working in medicine. You don't have to be a doctor or a consultant. You could be a paramedic, you could be a nurse, you could be, you know, somebody else who's involved in medicine. The career ladder for engineers is not clear to the public. I'm not sure it should be, but there is a lot of misunderstanding amongst the public. I know 20 years ago, I might mention to somebody that I was teaching electronic engineering, and they said, oh, fixing TVs. And I'd say, oh, no, oh, I don't know how to do that. And they'd look puzzled. So we use the job title engineer willy-nilly, when in fact the person might not actually be engineer in the way that we might be talking about this evening. So that the career structure needs clarification and publicity, I think, because there are lots of opportunities for people in engineering and science who do not do A-levels. Oh, well, these days they probably would have to do A-levels, but you know, they shouldn't have to do A-levels. You can be a river engineer or a river scientist. You spend your day in wellies wading through rivers, for instance. You know, we're not talking about people in the ivory towers of the universities. Engineers work in every aspect of our lives.
Thank you. I don't know if any other panelists wanted to comment on that sort of prestige around particular careers. Stephanie?
Yes, just briefly, I think to see that technical education has always suffered, you know, even briefly looking at it historically, it's always been the also ran. And I think that is a huge problem in the status that the technical schools were always seen slightly below the grammar schools. They came from a different direction. They were somebody else's problem. There wasn't enough money put into them in the tripartite system, so they just dwindled. And I think status has a huge amount to do with the way that engineering is perceived.
Becky, yes.
Yeah, I'd also present a slightly different perspective, actually, because I think that engineering is pretty prestigious, but it's much less well known as a career than medicine. Of course, medicine had its own professional trajectory, as I know colleagues on the panel would be the first to tell us. You know, it hasn't always been that medicine has been an incredibly high profile and prestigious career as it is now. But I guess, you know, that shows again sort of both movements of professionalization and social change. And I think that one of the things that could really help here is more information for young people in careers advice about wages. Because I suspect that actually if you compared the wages of sort of top engineers compared to top medics, it'd probably be quite an eye-opener. And the interesting research of my colleague, Professor Michael Rice, who again is looking at access to STEM, has shown that, interestingly, many girls who are interested in science are actually quite motivated and quite stimulated by finding out the details about, you know, good remuneration in STEM subjects. It doesn't motivate everybody, but it does motivate some. And then conversely, when I talk about gender constructions, my own research showed that a lot of young women who were motivated to study medicine actually created quite a feminine discourse around it. It was about vocational caring, and many of them talked about, you know, their interest in pediatrics and so forth. And so they were actually sort of creating this kind of feminine narrative around it. Not true for all girls, of course, but for some. So this issue again about sort of gender constructions, and I think it was Linda that was sort of talking about hard and soft, and these issues that sort of speak to our very identities, again, I think need to be unpicked.
Thank you, Becky. On that, I love the images that Stephanie showed of those career novels. I was wondering. I sort of two questions. We're going to finish at 6:30, but I just thought we maybe perhaps to think of around the idea of careers advice and the role that plays in this discussion. And the novel, the book cover that you showed was wonderful, Stephanie. So I do wonder. I mean, I know that the Fawcett report looked very much at the early years, and then if you're kind of coming to the end of the school cycle, do you think the careers advice is still problematic, and that perhaps, you know, careers advisors aren't opening up the possibilities of careers that break down these gender stereotypes, and both in terms of individual gender and also of the careers they're going into? So I just wondered, had you any kind of observations or comments on that?
I'm not sure about the advice today. But certainly my experience of careers advice was that there was a corridor, you know, there was a space in the corridor and you could go and look at the books, and they were very, very gendered as to the sort of things that people went to. And if you were really clever, you went to university, and if you weren't quite so clever, you went to teacher training college, and then you could do nursing. But really that was seen as a final fling. But the career novels really flourished in the 1950s, and in electronics was virtually the last one. And I noticed on the cover of that one, it says something about one in the technology series. Well, it was the only one. They disappeared after that. All the others were Brenda Bry's A Beauty Salon, and somebody becomes a florist, and lots of nursing ones, so very traditional occupations. But also interesting that one was one that was targeted more at girls who had done A levels, although Anne herself does an apprenticeship, and it covers all the they do refute all these problems about, is it dirty, you're going to have to work hard to counteract the male dominance, and all those sorts of ideas. But I don't know whether anyone else has any experience of current careers advice.
Does anyone else want to comment, or generally about careers? I think it seems pretty limited. I have to say my teenage children have had it, and yeah, it didn't seem great, to be honest. Yeah, it was reasonably gendered, I would say. I have a boy and 2 girls, yeah, and nothing revolutionary was happening there. It's quite disappointing.
Yeah, it's 20 years since I had to suffer through all of that, and the school careers advice is basically, well, you're going to university, you'll work it out then, because by that point I'd already applied. I mean, if you go even further back, I know that my mother was told in the 1960s that she shouldn't apply to do law because girls don't do law. So she did history instead, which obviously was, good. Studying history is a good thing, and then I did the same thing. But nobody was telling me what I couldn't do, but there was certainly nobody giving me alternatives for things I could do. Somebody who was at the time doing maths and physics as well as history and English, no one was kind of saying, well, have you thought about taking any of these further? So.
And I think it is quite underfunded as well, but it will be interesting perhaps to have a, and forgive me if anyone is a career advisor, I don't want to get into trouble, but to do some kind of research around that in alongside the early childhood report that the FOSA has just produced. That might be interesting for the future perhaps. So we've 1 minute left, so I am going to just say thank you really to our, again, really incredible panel, and I'm so grateful for them for giving up their time to be with us this evening and to talk what I think are really important issues impacting on young people and on industry and on academia in the years to come. And this is a problem that's gone on for too long. So we really, really want to make change happen here. And I think we've had some nice ideas here. And thank you very much also for everyone for attending. I think, yes, Dean has just posted. So the next event is, Dean, when's the next event in this series? Is it next month?
On the 12th of May, about LSBU 100 apprenticeships.
Excellent. Interesting. And apprenticeships, yes. Apprenticeships have mentioned a number of times in our discussions this evening, so that's very timely and a nice coincidence. Okay, so thank you all very, very much. Thank you, Dean, for organising. And thank you to Ruth and to Celia and to Claire Benson, the kind of co-curators of the centenary year. And yes, let's hope that, we will be smashing those gender stereotypes from now on. Everybody, get your hammers out, like the suffragettes. All right. Take care. Thank you very much. Dean, do you need to do anything, or are we done?